35% rate. So,
John, going back up to the consolidation of supplemental retirement plans, lower contribute, can you explain to me what's sort of the tax, why would they propose lower contribution rates? How does that help with revenue?
well, it's a way because you're making basically the trade-off would be if it's lower contribution rates, then presumably the theory is you'll be getting more in the way of currently taxable compensation. So if they drop the rate, the contribution level from say 10,000 to 5,000, the presumption is that 5,000 difference will come to you as current compensation that can be taxed. So the theory is
it's
if
just
they
so counter to the whole retirement security crisis we have on the national level. To me,
absolutely,
so
and that's the risk of that was the lesson of the Tax Reform Act of '86. When you get in this environment, there are all these sort of haircuts that are being administered, and one way politically to make a broad tax reform bill go is to give everybody a haircut. Say everyone's had to sort of chip in on this one, and so to come in and lower the contribution limits, make part of the contribution taxed for what's perceived to be higher income people, that has a real sort of political dynamic. But I mean, the administration, and here's this new wrinkle that I wanted to kind of brief you on because it sort of appeared when the budget was released yesterday for the first time. So keep in mind, we're starting out, so if you have a tax rate that's above 20%, suddenly you're now being taxed on part of your contributions to the plan that had been on a pre-tax basis. But now, as they say in the Vegematic commercial, wait, there's more. What he is now proposing is in effect to have a combined DC-DB overall limit. In other words, the administration says people are able to combine DB-DC with the supplemental retirement plans like 403B, 457 to get a substantial retirement benefit that's excessive for the tax system to be subsidizing. So what he is now proposing is that, and this would, as Ed and I were talking before the meeting, raise all kinds of major logistical headaches for public plans and private plans for that matter as well. What he is proposing is that you aggregate everyone, you take a participant, you aggregate all the plans that they participate in for the employer. So in the CalSTRS plan, 403B, 457, if that are down at the employer level, you aggregate those together, and basically the total benefit you can accrue is the equivalent of a $205,000 a year annuity, joint survivor annuity, which is basically the Section 415 limit that now applies to CalSTRS and all other public plans that participants can accrue a benefit from the qualified plan in excess of $205,000. We used to have this kind of spillover plan that I understand has now been terminated for the future, but so you may be thinking, well, $205,000, that's sort of the maximum under CalSTRS, what's the deal? Well, remember you got CalSTRS up here and you got the local plans, the 403B and 457, they're being administered by the employers down there. I mean, how are we going to coordinate all this? How are you going to know when the guy's exceeded, has a benefit that's, when you lump all these together, it's in excess of the limit? That's going to be a major logistical challenge, and each year, CalSTRS would be required to report everyone's accrued benefit at that point in time, presumably to the IRS, presumably to the participant, because you're not going to know, how much has the guy got down at the local employer level, 457 and 403B.
John, I have a question from Paul.
Thanks. On this, and I was reading about it in the newspaper this morning. It completely boggles the mind how you would go about this. It also includes IRAs and other things too. I mean, it's not just employer related. It's any tax advantaged. So it doesn't prevent the continued accumulation. It just means that any contributions that would add to a benefit, aggregate benefit of more than $205,000, that contribution would be taxed.
That's correct.
But it gets recalibrated every year, right?
Yeah. Well, this is one of the logistical nightmares. Yeah. What they've said is, and I'll just thank you for raising it. I was getting to it. Investment gains could continue. Because what they're proposing, the effective date is it takes effect on January 1, 2014. To everybody, this musical chairs, music stops, and boom, this applies. So it's not like these are new plans, new people, and new plans. It's everybody in the world at that moment in time. So what they're saying is you can no longer make contributions to the plan basically, if you made a contribution, it would be taxed in income, and it would be treated as an excess contribution that you then have to pull back out under this scenario. Investment gains could continue, but oh, by the way, if the plan's investment return was less than its actuarial assumed rate of return, you might be able to make a little bit more of a contribution to kind of fill in the gap. All which sounds great when you're sitting in a room, writing on the back of an envelope, but when you're trying to figure out how all this works, it's really a nightmare. They say, well, it's indexed just like 415 is, but
here's my question, is it that the contribution can't be made, or that the contribution can be made but it would be taxed?
well, what they said in the write-up, which is about a page and a half, is that they would treat it like an excess deferral in a pension plan where the contribution would be taxed and you'd be given a period of time to take it back out. Now, the challenge here, and part of this is there's a real back of the envelope dimension to this, because this was really written with sort of a DC plan in mind, because the whole DC plan is you're looking at what's going in, you're controlling what's going in, you're not looking at what's ending up. And so in our world, what's going in is sort of disconnected from what's coming out, in the sense that all the rules for DB plans focus on how much of a benefit have you accrued. How you fund that is kind of your business in the state and local world. And, we may want to be in a situation where if the benefits are going to be frozen, we still want to be able to get the contribution. So I think there's a lot more analytical and sort of conceptual, logistical work that needs to be done to implement this. I think this is probably dead on arrival, because, it's perceived to be sort of going after, the Romneys of the world who put in some sort of hedge fund investment
You
that
had
then,
$100 million.
and they say, well, this is the equivalent of a $3.4 million, maximum accumulation. Well, I don't know how they're assuming that you sort of annuitize this in the private sector to get $204,000, because as you know, the private sector, they just hand you this lump. They don't annuitize it. And that's one of the great benefits the CalSTRS does, is that you use the law of large numbers to provide a great benefit by a great service to the members by annuitizing yourself. I mean, $3.4 million invested in 10-year treasuries, if you're really nervous about the world, is not going to give you $205,000. So,
John, I think Ed, did you have?
I was just looking at the proposal itself, and it does say that you would not be able to make any further contributions, but then it goes on to sort of talk about, as John was saying, it would be treated like an excess accrual and subject to a whole lot of rules.
at the end of the day, you got to kind of take them back out, at least based on what they're. But again, that's kind of, they're equating additional contributions with an additional benefit growth, as opposed to contributions that are sort of funding an accrual that's already said to happen. So
Contributions that are funding an unfunded liability.
exactly. I mean, that's why I think what happened was this was originally pitched. They started floating this last week. It was IRA, Romney, remember that? Cayman Island, that's how they kind of mark everything these days, with some, kind of caricature. And then it was DC plans, and I think that was somewhat of a surprise yesterday when the details came out, because they pretty closely guard the details on things like this till the actual release was that it's going to cover DB plans. Well, the reasoning keeps breaking down, as you point out, when you try to apply this in a DB plan environment, and the problem of having to aggregate multiple plans that are being administered by people at different levels. And so it really, just on the reporting alone for CalSTRS would be a nightmare. And it just, part of it, I think, is just the political necessity of, if you're going to try to have tax reform, you have to go after the big kahunas. This is a way to go after the big kahunas in a way that's perceived as sort of not hurting as much, kind of the middle income people, as opposed to just, if you lower the contribution limits, and then everybody suffers. Even if the 403B limit's cut in half, then you're hurting, the younger teacher as much as the kind of the fat cat perceived school superintendent. So, I think, as I say, I think this is probably dead on arrival, but it shows when you get into the fluid, kind of influx tax reform environment, wild ideas can start to take hold. And again, they don't start by trimming back what's there now, they say, oh, here's this brand new way of doing it. That's one size fits all. And so, you know, I think part of what I'm trying to do this morning is just give you an idea of a kind of, this is a cautionary tale, and we need to be vigilant because there are lots of ways in which problems could be caused for public plans.
I just, you know, I think you're right. These things sometimes should just take off. A year ago, this 28% concept was not really thought to be taken seriously, and now it seems to be this great idea that can be applied to so many things, to all sorts of deductions, whether it's charitable deductions or tax-exempt interest or employee health benefits, and it seems to be very seriously being considered. So it does seem to me that people can quickly glom on to some one-size-fits-all, and it would seem to me that, you know, hopefully it's only been out there for a day, but that there's going to be a lot of discussion about how this is a completely unworkable situation. The 28% actually is not so unworkable, and maybe that's one of the reasons it's taken
It's
off.
going in, so you can give a haircut when it's going in. You're not
Right,
kind of catching
right.
people
But
where they are.
this is completely bizarre.
But it just shows you where, you know, things,
Right.
you know, things can happen. And, you know, you do have, we work very well with NASR and NCTR, and they're very active in, you know, communicating the concerns about this in a constructive way. And so we will continue to do that because I think it's just important for the public plans to be active in every step of the way because, you know, one size fits all is very problematic for us.
John, I've got a question for Michael.
I guess I'm not quite sure I understand one part. How does this, you're saying that the limitation on contributions would apply to the DB plan?
That's the way they've written it up. What they've written up is this page and a half description that I think was started with a focus on DC because that's how you regulate. DC is a defined contribution. That's your benefit basically. That's, you know, the more you put in, the more the account grows, as you know. But they then decided to apply it to DB plans, so they're kind of stuck with this template that says, you know, you can't put anything more in once your account gets to be a certain size. But for DB, as I say, as you know, the funding is disconnected from the benefit. You can keep putting in contributions to amortize an unfunded liability, but that doesn't cause the benefit to accrue anymore. They seem to be equating contributions with accruing a benefit, and so that's why I think it seems to me DB was kind of stuck in at the last minute. Now, we live under this dollar limit, this overall dollar limit of $205,000 is what applies to us under Section 415. So we have to live with that right now. So at first blush, that wouldn't seem to be as much of a hit. But there's this contributions dimension that suggests that the contributions have to cease, which I don't think they would intend once they realize you're funding a benefit that already exists as opposed to accumulating more by way of the contributions. And then there's this coordination with, okay, the guy's over, so where do we take it out? Do we take it out of the 403B? Do we take it out of the DB plan? But that's what, there's a very much of a back of the envelope quality to this that I think hopefully under further scrutiny people will recognize. But that's the way they've written it up. They don't differentiate contributions under DB or DC. They just say they have to cease.
But the 415 limitations that look at both DB and DC benefits is in the law currently, correct?
Well, they point out that for many years, as you know, there was an overall limit. You had to take together whatever benefit you got under DB and DC, and there was an overall limit on both. That was repealed, I think, in the last Pension Reform Act, say it was in 2006 or so, the Pension Protection Act, I think, or may have been before that. So that's one of the arguments that the administration's making, is that people can use multiple plans to get a retirement benefit that exceeds the 415 limit on DB, for example, that you can kind of keep adding, you can keep tiering on these additional plans. So if you have multiple plans, you can end up with a higher overall benefit than if you just had the one plan. And that's why they say there needs to be, in effect, a reinstatement of the type of limit you're describing.
So in fact, what we're talking about is going back to a system that was in place for 30 years?
At least, I would say. Yeah. And, you know, it's also where you draw the line. I mean, they're kind of drawing the line in a way that, I mean, because it used to be that it was kind of it wasn't double, you know, you didn't get sort of a double benefit by having two, but you could get some more by having multiple plans than you could if you just had one. But you're right, so they are kind of going back to the old way of doing things.
My overall comment, and I haven't studied this and haven't looked at it, but I'm a little bit bothered by your presentation. Because if I didn't know what I know about pension law on the private sector, I would assume that all this is brand new, that this had never been done before, that actuaries are not going to know how to do this. But in fact, that's not the case. I'm not saying whether this is right or whether this is good, but it's not all brand new. And I think you do a disservice to the other members of this board by implying, and that's the implication that I got from you, that this is dead on arrival because I don't know how this is going to be done. Nobody knows how to do this. That's not the case. It may not be simplification. It may not be the right way to go policy-wise. But I just want to say I'm bothered by the way you are presenting this to this board. And I think this legislative committee deserves a more objective presentation. And I would hope that you would consider that.
I appreciate your comments. What I'm trying to do is also focus on the reporting obligations that for the first time that CalSTRS would have to provide an annual report of each person's accrued benefit and how that would come into play and the coordination that would have to happen with CalSTRS and the local plans.
Absolutely, I understand that. But please, this is something that has applied up until 2006. We're not going to have to start from square one in terms of how to do this. There are consultants and advisors out there who may have to dust off some things that they haven't done in a few years. And again, I'm not saying this is right. I'm not saying this is good. Haven't made that judgment. But I am bothered by the way that this is being presented.
Well, I appreciate your comments. I've certainly strived to be objective this is a new development. I'm trying to explain what's coming into play versus what's the law now. So I appreciate your comments. The tax reform also is going to have potential implications for CalSTRS as an investor in the marketplace because Chris and his investment staff are, as you know, engaged in a broad range of investments in the market. And one of the things that I think shows how credible these tax reform efforts are the way they're kind of getting down into the details of financial products, of how partnerships are treated. And this changes I'm going to discuss now were proposed by the House Ways and Means Chairman Camp, a Republican, who's trying to rationalize various areas of the code, one of which is financial products. And as Chris can attest, this is a very complex area in which there are whole cottage industries of my peers in the tax bar that basically can sort of create a derivative with whatever number of features are necessary to have ordinary tax treatment or capital gain or loss. And if you have these 5 features, you're ordinary. If you have those 5 features, you're capital, even though you maybe end up in the same economic position. And he's proposed to basically have a one-size-fits-all approach. That is, derivatives have to be marked to market annually. People are taxed as ordinary gain or loss on that mark to market change. Now, again, CalSTRS is exempt, but I think this just shows you how wholly apart from CalSTRS as a retirement plan, how CalSTRS as an investor could suddenly face a different marketplace where there are different types of instruments available than in which they previously invested. And another area that I think is going to cause substantial controversy is a possible cap on the deductibility of business interest expense. And that's an issue that's under very serious consideration, could have a real impact on the fixed income market. Basically, in order to get from a 35% corporate rate to a 30% rate, they have to repeal all industry-specific preferences. If they repeal accelerated depreciation, it gets it down to 28% corporate rate. But in order to get to 25, which has been the target, especially on House Ways and Means Chairman Camp, they have to cap interest deductions. So that's going to be, let's say, a potential major impact in the fixed income market. Chairman Camp's also proposing tax changes to the pass-throughs. CalSTRS, as you know, invests in real estate, other partnership-type investments, in which right now there are a variety of these sort of special allocation rules where you can really do all kinds of exotic things in terms of sending income deductions different ways. Chairman Camp proposes to streamline that to basically take away the current flexibility to make these special allocations of income and deductions among partners. It's basically going to be kind of follow the cash. It's going to be a much simpler system that's going to change the way in which these pass-throughs have operated, where they have tax-exempt and taxable partners, and they have kind of allocations of income and benefits based on the special tax needs of each. There also would be a withholding, at any level withholding tax that could create cash flow problems inside the partnership. So again, there are lots of ways in which CalSTRS can be affected in this debate, and we will certainly be trying to keep an eye on the investor side of things, because many of these changes that they're considering could have broad ramifications. Just quickly on some of the challenges that CalSTRS is going to face on other fronts. The Nunez bill continues to be out there. He's been circulating it to dear colleagues, seeking co-sponsors. We understand he may put it in this week. I think that as a result of a lot of the missionary work that has been done at the grassroots level by plans across the country, I think there's a greater awareness in Congress now that public plans are managing themselves and are taking actions to assure their long-term solvency. I mean, I think at last count, NCSL, there were some 40 states had adopted significant changes to their state systems to try to bolster their long-term financial security. So I think I think this movement is sort of crested, but nonetheless it's out there, and to the extent that you have this kind of debate, this sort of message happening, that we need to standardize public plan reporting, that there's some sort of manipulation going on, I think is continues to, as we just talked about, create sort of an aura that maybe public plans need to be more closely regulated. So that's the long-term, I think, concern of this effort, even though it may not see the light of day as law. The next issue is one that's really sort of a classic solution in search of a problem, and that is the IRS, sort of on its own, out of the blue, decided to take on this kind of metaphysical question of what is a governmental plan, because governmental plan status confers some significant benefits in terms of tailored federal rules. The funding rules don't apply. ERISA would otherwise come into play. So governmental plan status is not just some sort of semantical exercise. It has real impact. And the IRS, I think, sort of bit off more than it could chew here, because they came up with this lengthy series of factors that really, I think, led to a lot of uncertainty and really, I think, didn't address a lot of the kind of unique characteristics, again, of governmental plans. One of the things we found out is that there are pockets of workers that are covered in these plans that, may not be traditional governmental employees. I mean, for example, in one state, the school bus drivers, they privatized the bus driver activity, and so you had all these people who were still in the plan, bus drivers, who were now working for a private company because they didn't want to toss them out of the plan. Well, in theory, if you just have a small number of non-governmental governmental employees in your plan, it no longer qualifies as a governmental plan. The key sort of focus of controversy there is the charter school teachers, and that has generated a tremendous amount of public comment from charter schools across the country to the IRS, and I think has really slowed down this process because the move to charter schools has, been broad-based around the country, and I think the IRS now realizes that if they take a harsh position on what a governmental plan is, because of the charter school, that there could be a tremendous amount of dislocation. So I think there was this effort was a long time in coming to fruition, and I think it's going to be, probably a longer time to actually moving forward. It's in the IRS business plan to deal with this coming year, but I don't think there's a lot of prospect that it's going to be put through to final regulations. But again, it's one we're coordinating with NASRA and NCTR on. Bond ratings, as I'm sure you've seen in the paper, this is kind of a new front. Pension disclosure and securities offerings of state and local governments has become kind of a new venue for judging pension plans. And the SEC has this new enforcement unit focusing on public plans. They most recently went after Illinois, which had been sort of an extreme situation, but it's a pretty cumbersome tool to try to regulate pension public plan funding by way of the securities fraud laws. But that was certainly the case with Illinois. We're not aware of a lot of other jurisdictions that are under investigation, but it's just another way in which people who are perhaps less familiar with public plans than, say, GASB, are nonetheless sort of providing guidance on what's proper funding, what's proper disclosure of that funding. And so the more cooks you have stirring the pot, the more complicated and multiple numbers, and it just sort of, I think, creates kind of a cacophony of sort of templates about how you judge what a public plan should be doing. And now Moody's is getting into the mix, and they're sort of going for the trifecta now. They under the theory that in order to provide bond ratings, they want to have some ability to have comparability among public plans. So they've come up with this template that basically provides for an assumed 5.5% investment return, no smoothing, an amortization period that may be as low as 17 years, and that's a template they're sort of taking around to each of the states. I mean, it's really, kind of carrying this red dress around. Okay, Wyoming, you try it on. Idaho, you try it on. Well, Wyoming, you look better in that than Idaho. And so, it doesn't take account of the local characteristics of the, the risk profile or the funding status. It has the potential, to add yet another set of numbers. And I think as Rick and Chris, I'm sure, have advised you, I mean, there's already this sort of complication. You got the plan actuaries numbers that govern funding. You got GASB's numbers that go to the financial statements, but not funding. And now you've got the credit rating agencies going to the employer's credit rating are going to have yet another set of numbers. And I think that creates just communication issues for the plans to try to explain, which numbers, apply for what purpose. And they're easily, get into the situation where people can seize on, one set of numbers that maybe don't go to the funding and start making policy advice and policy decisions based on that. The Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board is also preparing to kind of begin an effort to look at how public plan disclosures in the context of the securities offerings of the employers come into play. So you've got a lot of actors that are sort of maybe not new to public plans, but are not familiar with the kind of down in the weeds technical issues about public plans, and yet they're going to be sort of, setting out guideposts for how public plans ought to be judged. And I think that, again, creates a potential for misunderstanding and certainly communications issues for people trying to make judgments about how public plans really are faring.
John, I have a question.
Sure.
Paul.
No, I finish on this, but when you're finished discussing the what's going on with public pension plan disclosure in the municipal market, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, so, I mean, and it's actually more of a comment. I mean, this is the business I'm in, and so I'm very, very much involved with this, was involved with the NABL, I was on the NABL Pension Disclosure Task Force and things like that. And it's the very first and almost only question I get when I talk to institutional investors about bonds now, is what's the status of pensions? And I think, I agree with you that it's a completely confusing situation where Moody's is now saying, we're going to define 5.5% as the discount rate. We're going to, because we want to be able to normalize everybody's liabilities and compare them, so we don't want everybody choosing their own discount rates. And then you've got GASB, and then you've got the SEC. But I think the SEC, I think, is the most important one for us. And the reason is because the SEC has taken action, and they're the only ones who can really take action against the public agency themselves. The MSRB, nobody even understands why they're getting involved in this. They don't have a mandate to be involved in pensions, and they can't do anything to issuers. They can regulate market participants, but not issuers. But the SEC in Illinois, and previously in New Jersey, and previously in San Diego, said that the fault was the public pension fund and its sponsor specifically. In fact, they went after individuals in San Diego. They did not go after individuals in New Jersey or Illinois. And what they basically said was the disclosure was not sufficient as to the fact that there is a problem. And so if you look, for example, reading the SEC action on Illinois, they say, this is just one out of many things, but I think it typifies where they're going. The state disclosed that its UAAL, unfunded liability, could increase in the future by virtue of a variety of facts, such as a decrease in the performance of investments and changes in legislation, actuarial assumptions, inflation, benefits, or the state's contribution rate. However, the state misleadingly omitted to disclose the primary driver of the increase, the insufficient contributions mandated by the statutory funding plan. So what they have been going after states for and is a failure to disclose what they know is the source of the problem. And the reaction by the municipal bond market has then been overreaction. The state of California now does 40 pages of disclosure in its official statements about CalPERS and CalSTRS. And it's more information that makes any sense. But the problem is that once we've gotten to that point, now we've got the problem of, okay, we've disclosed 40 pages. It opens up 40 pages that can be nitpicked over as to whether it was accurate or not. And so I think that you know, it is very consistent with what this board wants to do and what CalSTRS wants to do, which is to say, yes, we have an underfunding problem. We don't want to hide that underfunding problem. We know that the underfunding problem is, as they said in Illinois, because of insufficient contributions, and we want to make that really clear because we got to get the legislature to do something about it. So I don't really see a risk to this board. I think actually what the SEC is saying is very consistent with what we want to do. What they say should have been done is what we want to do.
I agree, and I think the other thing that the SEC pointed to was sort of a breakdown in process, that there were no controls, there was no communication, no one seemed to really kind of know how A fit with B and didn't care to know, and so I think having a rigorous process that you follow in the management of the plan with the board and being transparent, and I think is all very helpful, because I think that was, the sort of the crowning blow is that they didn't disclose and they're sloppy and didn't, kind of turned away, I think was the problem that the SEC pointed to, so.
And I think most issuers have certainly the state of California, never even had that problem, but has a very robust and thorough process for vetting disclosure. But they also even acknowledge that Illinois now does too. They were basically slapping their hand for something they did 5 years ago.
If I could add one more comment too. I think even though forgetting the special needs maybe of the bond market, I do think from a public perception and the interest of transparency, it's valuable to have this convergence of information even though 40 pages may seem long.
Right.
It's important to have that encyclopedic presentation of the funding situation rather than think, what does the Department of Finance present on this issue? What does the Controller's Office present on this issue? What do we present in our CAFR? I mean, I think it's valuable now to have a public conversation with all those facts put together. And even in our transmittal letter this year, because we're required to transmit the CAFR to the legislature and the governor, we actually alluded to the Illinois action in that letter saying, hey, we need to be all more attentive to this. This is what happens when there isn't adequate transparency around these issues. And I just think, just like we had this conversation in the legislative committee, I think we all need to err on this side of pushing information out and recognizing that's where the balance of the conversation needs to be. So, we'll watch these things carefully, but I think overall it's helping the conversation, even though it's burdensome too.
Are you good? Paul?
Let me just cover these last two.
John, I have one more.
Oh, sure.
Michael.
How does this impact the local jurisdictions? I understand how California bonds are impacted by this, but I guess I'm confused if a local jurisdiction that is a participant in CalSTRS is issuing a security. I mean, their obligation is to make contributions. They are not technically, if you can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, the state is responsible for making the contributions that Paul is talking about, not that local jurisdiction. But are we looking at a situation where in their disclosure, they have to disclose contribution obligations that are beyond what the state has required? I mean, I'm just.
Well, I think it's kind of similar, as I understand it, to kind of what happened with Gatsby, which is they will take Moody's, for example, would compute the overall sort of unfunded liability of the plan and then parcel it out among the participating employers as a liability kind of on their balance sheet for purposes of their credit worthiness, that this is the statutory obligation of the city of Glendale may be to make X amount of contributions, but as I understand how Moody's would say, they'd say, well, but actually Glendale is going to, having to be bearing, 5%.
Robin really has responsibility here for
wondering
making that
too.
determination with the
Right.
employers and kind of working through the education around this.
So we are beginning those conversations because there potentially could be a significant impact in that the GASB requirements for us, as well as the somewhat parallel information from Moody's perspective, is that we need to at least make available the employer's proportionate share information. And then it's up to their auditors in cooperation with the information that we have prepared to determine how to present that on their financial statements. But given the calculation of the net pension liability and the examples that we have prepared, based on their proportionate share, in some cases it dwarfs any assets that they have on their balance sheet. So it actually puts them into a negative reserve situation.
But in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, those entities don't have a technical obligation to satisfy that liability.
Well, again, this comes down to the discussion about the responsibility and who assumes it. And again, our disclosure responsibilities center around making available the proportionate share information, and we have options in terms of how to calculate that. We are currently leaning towards calculation based on the percentage of contributions. And then we have other information we have to provide based on the changes in the pension expense and the liability over time from year to year. We have been dialoguing quite a bit with our own auditors and the AICPA. And again, the final decision becomes one that the local entity makes with their auditors. And we will provide a variety of information to them. But it's a complicated balancing act, I would say, in terms of how that responsibility is reported between the state and the various local entities.
Ed, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, actually, I think you're speaking more on the GASB issue, though, right? Yes. And I think Moody's may well treat it differently. The sense when I had talked to Keith Brainerd at NASRA about the Moody's situation, because he'd been looking at it pretty closely. His impression from Moody's is that they were likely going to assign that responsibility to the state. So in terms of their own bond rating, they would see that as being a state liability and not a local liability. But as Robin says, on the GASB side, it's a little bit more problematic and uncertain.
Yeah, I guess the point of my comment is that I'm trying to get my head around this thing. It sounds like this is an extremely complicated issue that these various organizations are trying to disclose in a simplified fashion. And the big problem that I think I see is they haven't addressed the first question, which is it their responsibility? And because if it's not their responsibility, because what should be disclosed in their documents is whatever their responsibility, however remote, whatever their responsibility is, but that's not clear. But I'm happy to hear that Moody's is looking at it from the state perspective. From where I sit, it seems to me, and I'm not trying to be an expert on this, so I'm just going by what, the statute seems to say. But I'm happy that you're working with them and trying to push them down the right path, because they seem to have kind of skipped over some initial steps to go on to the more complicated issues. But that was all. Just trying to see where that was in this.
But that was a big part of what we were talking to GASB about, was this issue about it's the state's problem, not the locals' problem. But appears they may have gone in different directions, but we're still trying to work that through.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, John.
All right, let me just kind of wrap up here, Madam Chair, as I know things are kind of running along. One federal measure I just want to call your attention to that's kind of below the radar screen, that is that Senator Shelby, who's a senior member of the Senate Banking Committee, has seized on the D.C. Circuit's ruling in the proxy access case that the SEC supposedly did not do a sufficiently robust cost-benefit analysis of the proxy access regulations. And so I think with the continuing Democratic control of the Senate, they see that repealing Dodd-Frank is not going to work. So they're going to try to sort of take a different tack, which is to mandate sort of an impossible cost-benefit analysis, which is basically every single potential cost imaginable has to be sort of weighed and addressed before a new regulation can be proposed. So it's a subtle way of trying to throw sand in the gears of the SEC and the CFTC as they try to embark on the financial regulations to implement Dodd-Frank. Just quickly, House Financial Services, new leadership, Jeb Henseling from Texas. He spends most of his time trying to repeal Dodd-Frank, but I think it falls in the case of be careful what you wish for, because he also has been very strident proposing significant capital increases for banks and financial institutions, and says he's pro-free enterprise, not pro-business. So it's interesting. Things may always turn out a little bit different than they seem. But Maxine Waters, I think people are going to be very pleasantly surprised about how hardworking. She's got this kind of firebrand image that's, I think, ill-deserved, because she's very hardworking. Found out with her on that proxy access effort. She's always prepared, very knowledgeable, spends a lot of time going to school on the issues, and so I think she'll be a worthy successor to Barney Frank on the Democratic side. As you know, Chairman Johnson announced his retirement, and this has set off this kind of domino effect of who might take over if the Democrats keep control of the Senate. Jack Reed is probably going to move on to Armed Services. Chuck Schumer is being pressured to take it over because the next person in line has all the Wall Street and the financial institutions sort of levitating. That would be Sherrod Brown, would be chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. So it's really interesting how retirements and elections can have a big difference on who actually is in charge under the seniority system. And then last but not least, I always come hoping that I don't have to talk about this, but invariably I do.
This is not going to be a slide on your presentation, but not going
We
yet.
got 300 million, 15 million to go. We get tantalizingly close. I mean, you read about congressional gridlock, you read about partisan frictions, but, we managed to get a bipartisan congressional champions, Senator Feinstein. You wait long enough, she becomes chairman of the subcommittee and has jurisdiction over it. Kevin McCarthy, who's the number 3 Republican in the House, our longtime champion dating back to when he was on Bill Thomas's staff, and Adam Schiff. As a result of their collective efforts, we were in the bills, and then the process breaks down. So it's sort of heartbreaking to get that close. Who knows this year? I mean, the administrations, they're obligated to push it. But with this whole sequester process, who knows? So at this point, my concern is just trying to keep everybody alive long enough to get this done. I mean, I think
About right. That is about
at this point,
right.
they'll be delivering the
Well
check
said.
to me at the assisted living facility. So anyway, happy to field any last questions on.
Any other questions from the committee? Danny?
John, this actually isn't for you, you might play into it. So Ed, there's been an assembly bill introduced, 913 Chow, that talks about creating for charter schools all the things that would be required in the definition of government plan. Am I reading that right? So if that passed, then our charter schools and our system would meet the definition that they're proposing?
Now, we've talked to the author's office a few times, and what we pointed out to them is it's really way too early to know what the IRS will require, if anything. And quite honestly, even what's in the bill, it is intended to address the issues that the IRS raises, but what's in the bill would not even address what are referred to as the major factors that the IRS had floated out there last year. So, that is what they're trying to work on, but I think it's, as I've told their office, it's really way too early to try to enact anything to address that issue. I mean, in terms of the IRS, there may be other reasons to pass the bill, but it isn't clear that it's going to actually address what the IRS issues are.
Okay, because the only thing I think it really addresses is the Brown Act, correct?
Yeah, that's part of it. But some of the major factors are things like who is the board elected or appointed? Who does that? Do they have police powers, which charter schools clearly don't? There's a number of things, and actually on every of the 5 major tests, they almost all fail 4 of the 5 of them. So it's and the bill itself in its current form doesn't really address those. So, but that was clearly what they're trying to do.
All right. No other questions? Thanks so much, John. Appreciate it. All right.
Thank you, John.
Thanks. So Ed.
Yeah, just a couple of things in the CEO report. One is just to draw your attention to the goldenrod, which is the update on all the legislation. You'll see the 4 bills that are in bold, which are the board-sponsored bills. All of those passed out of the Assembly PERS committee yesterday, all on consent, which is great, which meant that there was absolutely no concerns that anybody had with any of those. So they'll move on to Assembly Appropriations Committee. So we're hopeful that they'll continue to move through the process. And then the other thing, just to give you an update on Mary Ann's unceasing efforts to meet with every legislator before they move on to other offices in some cases. She's met with 83 out of the 120 so far, with the assistance of Sharon and with Paul. So we're working our way through. So far, the conversation has been extraordinarily good. Sharon and Paul can certainly weigh in on their perspective, and Mary Ann as well. But meeting with both Democrats and Republicans, senators and Assembly members, they all get the issue with our funding. They all seem to be ready to help us work on it, and some have a high level of enthusiasm. So we're really pleased that it's worked out as well as it has.
Yeah, I don't know what my count is with I've come up, I think, 4 or 5 times to do some meetings with Marianne, and one time Paul did join us for a meeting, for a day of meetings, and I have a lot of respect for what you do, Marianne. It's a grueling job to meet with legislator after legislator, but I will say that, first of all, I just want to say, I think Marianne has done an excellent job of communicating to our legislators. It's a tough, challenging job, and I think she's communicating effectively and clearly. And as Ed mentioned, legislators have been really receptive. I mean, I think that they know there's an issue, and there seems to be some movement. And I know we have a spot bill that is out there. So it's been an educational experience for me, but really enjoyable. And I've found myself to be fairly optimistic about, state government. I was kind of walking in not sure how it was going to come across. So I'm really grateful for Marianne's leadership in this arena, and we'll continue to check in to see how things are moving along. So, and we're going to try and do some LA visits to get Mr. Lawson involved, and so we'll keep you posted on that. So, great. Anything else, Ed?
So,
Okay. We have the review for information requests. Do we have any information requests?
Just the bill that's coming, the status of the firearms bill.
Okay, great. And then we have a draft agenda for the next committee meeting. You can take a look at that. And opportunities for statements from the public. Does anybody from the public want to speak? Seeing none, I move can I move that? Can I move a motion to adjourn?
You can just declare it adjourned.
I declare adjourned for legislative committee.